So now as we move on to talk about the figured bass symbols for seventh chords, I'm going to flip the script a bit and actually see if you can come up with the full figured bass symbols for each of our seventh chords that I have here. I have a seventh chord in root position. I have one in first inversion, second inversion, and then third inversion. All of these are inversions of the same chord, which happens to be an F major minor seventh chord. It's an F major triad with the seventh up top, right? And then they're kind of jumbled differently here, but it's all the same chord. But what I want you to do is come up with, again, use your knowledge of figured bass so far to come up with the symbols. As you're doing that, a couple of things to keep in mind. First of all, I want to make sure that I'm measuring all of these different intervals from the bass. Remember, figured bass doesn't necessarily care where the root is. It just wants to know what are the notes as they're represented as intervals above, whichever that lowest note is, okay? So I'm going to use the lowest note as my starting point, my lowest note as my starting point to figure out each of the other notes. Okay, and then when I figure that out, I take all of those numbers and I'm going to write them in descending order. And as you do that, remember, when you find ones that are larger than an octave, which you will here because I purposely written the first and second inversions each in open position, you're going to write the simple versions of those intervals rather than the compound. So once I come up with those simple intervals, I write them all in descending order, and I'm not going to include the quality. In other words, I'm not going to write down whether it's major, minor, diminished, augmented of each of those intervals, just the numeric piece. Okay, so go ahead and give it a shot. All right, so as I mentioned before, I purposely wrote the first and second inversions in open position, and I've written the root position and the third inversion in closed position. And when I look at those and I see that those are each in closed position, I'm actually going to save myself a couple of seconds of work here, right? I know that when I'm finished writing the figures, they need to appear in descending order. So what I'll do is I'll save myself a little bit of time with my closed position notes and start by talking about the interval to the uppermost note, and then I'll talk about kind of them in descending order like that. Okay, so now in this case, from my F to my E flat, I know that that's a minor seventh, but all I need to be concerned with when writing the figured bass symbol is the numeric portion or the generic interval. So I'm just going to write down that 7. Okay, and now I'll come down. I'm going to measure to the C, but again, I'm going to measure from the F. I measure everything from the lowest note in the stack. So F to C is a fifth, and then F to A is a third. So this shows us how for all root position seventh chords, they're all going to be represented, they all can be represented by the full figure of 7, 5, 3, which shouldn't be surprising because, I mean, that's really kind of how we construct seventh chords to begin with. We take a triad, which means that I've taken a root and I've found a note a fifth above it and then a third above it, right? And then I'm adding in there a seventh to that chord to turn a triad into a seventh chord. So that really just kind of goes along very well with how we've talked about chord construction all along, right? So that's my figured bass symbol for root position seventh chords. Now, as I move on to my first inversion seventh chords, I'm again, I know that, in terms of inversions, that's a third of the chord, but that doesn't really have any bearing on how I talk about the intervals above the bass. So I'm just going to measure the intervals, okay? So here I'll go ahead and measure from, bottom to top. So this A to E flat, I recognize that as a fifth. It's a diminished fifth, making it a tritone, but all I need to do is worry about the numeric portion of that. I don't need to worry about the fact that it's a tritone or that it's diminished. I'm just going to write that number 5 somewhere in the stack. Okay, and then I go from this A, I'm going to go way up here to this C, which is a tenth, right? But all a tenth is an octave plus a third. So I don't need to worry about the number 10. I'm just going to use a simplified version of that and call it a third. So I'm going to write a number 3 somewhere in there. Okay, and now I'm going to go from this A, again, always starting from the lowest note in the stack, from this A up to this F, right? Well, that's quite a long way, but it turns out the simple version of that interval is just a sixth. It's a sixth plus an octave, but I'm going to write the simple version being a sixth, right? And that 6 is actually bigger than 5, so I'm going to try to squeeze that into the top of the stack there, okay? And of course, if I want to be nice and neat, then I might just kind of rewrite all of that. 6, 5, 3. And that actually is the full figured bass symbol for any first inversion seventh chord. Okay. Now for the second inversion seventh chord, I'm going to use the same process. I have this C, and I'm just going to measure intervals. This C to this A is a sixth. Cool. Starting from the same place, this C to this E flat is an octave plus a third. I'm just going to worry about the third piece. all right? And then this C to this F is an octave plus a fourth. So I'm just going to worry about that fourth. Now, I need to rewrite this because these two notes here are kind of in flipped order. So I'm just going to rewrite those as 4, 3. Right? So again, for a second inversion seventh chord, that can be represented by the figures 6, 4, 3 above whichever note is serving as the bass. Right? And finally, our third inversion. Now, I see that this is in closed position again, so I'm going to go ahead and save myself a little bit of time. I'm going to measure, starting with the uppermost note. So this E flat to C is a sixth. And then this E flat to A, hey, there's that tritone of ours, but in this case it's represented as a fourth, right? So I'm going to write in the number 4. And then E flat to F is just a second, so 2. Okay, so that's a full figured bass, the full symbol for figured bass for third inversion seventh chord. Now, that's a lot of numbers for seventh chords, right? So just as we had shorthands for triads, we have shorthands for seventh chords as well, okay? And here's what I'll do. I'll kind of write them down here. For root position seventh chords, we summarize 7, 5, 3 with just the number 7. So if we have a bass line and there's a number 7 of it, it means to build a seventh chord with whichever note we see there as the root. Okay. For our first inversion, then we're just going to summarize those using these top numbers here of 6, 5. Okay, so first inversion seventh chords are abbreviated as 6, 5 chords. Now, for our second inversion, we can't really use 6, 4 because that's already taken up by our our second inversion triads. So we're just going to opt for these two numbers here, the 4 and the 3. So second inversion seventh chords are represented as 4, 3 chords. And then for our third inversion, there's a couple of different options. I can either do a 4, 2, but I can also just use the 2. Right? And I'm getting ready to show you right now why I like to use the 2. Besides the fact that it just saves me a little bit of lead or ink on the page, right? So check this out. This can be a lot to remember until you realize kind of what's going on here. Watch. When I have a root position seventh chord, I represent that using the number 7. For first inversion, that's a 6, 5. Second inversion, seventh chord is represented by 4, 3. And I like to represent third inversion just by using a 2. And it turns out that that's really just descending numbers, right? So when I was first learning inversions and figured bass symbols and all of that for chords, for triads and seventh chords, I actually had an easier time remembering them for seventh chords because it's just kind of a descending pattern, right? So there we go. There are the figured bass symbols, both the full symbols and the abbreviations for triads and seventh chords.